Darkness, silence, then the roar of 10,000 engines cutting through the night. June 6th, 1944. The world stood on the edge of a knife. One day, one beach, one chance to change the course of human history forever. But what you think you know about D-Day is only half the story. The real story, the untold story, lives in the shadows, in the whispers of the men who never came home, in the secrets buried beneath the sand, in the choices made in the dead of night that determined whether freedom would survive or fall into eternal darkness. This is the War Files WWII, and this is the untold story of D-Day. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about the most important day of the 20th century. London, 1943. Behind closed doors in rooms thick with cigarette smoke and tension, the most audacious military plan in history was taking shape. They called it Operation Overlord, but calling it a plan doesn't capture the impossibility of what they were attempting. Imagine coordinating the movements of over 3 million soldiers, 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, all converging on a 50-mile stretch of fortified French coastline defended by the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. General Dwight D. Eisenhower knew the stakes. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the blood of hundreds of thousands would be on his hands. The Nazis would remain unbeaten. Hitler's fortress Europe would become impenetrable, and the darkness would win. So in those smoke-filled rooms, brilliant minds worked 18-hour days, moving pins across maps, calculating tides, moon phases, weather patterns. They were playing chess with destiny itself, and they had exactly one move to get it right. But here's what they never taught you in school. The success of D-Day didn't just depend on firepower or bravery. It depended on the greatest con job in military history. Meet the army that never existed. Phantom divisions, inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter filling the airwaves with lies. This was Operation Bodyguard, the code name for the most elaborate deception operation ever conceived. The Allies knew they couldn't just show up in Normandy. The Germans would slaughter them on the beaches. So they had to make Hitler believe the invasion was coming somewhere else. Anywhere else. Pas-de-Calais, Norway, even the Balkans. They created an entire fake army group commanded by General George Patton, the one General Hitler feared most. They built fake landing craft in British harbors. They had actors playing the roles of officers in pubs, deliberately letting secrets slip to known German spies. They even dropped a corpse into the Mediterranean carrying false invasion plans, Operation Mincemeat. The body was discovered exactly as planned. The Germans took the bait, and the most incredible part? It worked. Even after the landings began on June 6th, Hitler kept his massive panzer divisions near Calais, waiting for the real invasion that would never come. Thousands of Allied soldiers owed their lives to an army of rubber tanks and lies. That's the genius you've never heard about. June 4th, 1944. The invasion fleet was ready. 175,000 men packed into ships, many of them already seasick from the violent Channel storms. And then, Eisenhower received the worst possible news. Meteorologist Group Captain James Stagg stood before the Supreme Commander and delivered a forecast that could doom the entire operation. A massive storm system was moving in, waves 20 feet high, winds that would capsize landing craft and scatter paratroopers across the French countryside like leaves. Eisenhower made the agonizing decision: stand down, postpone. But postponing meant keeping 175,000 men, many who'd already been briefed on the secret objectives, locked on ships for days. The security risk was catastrophic. The German spies would figure it out. And there was another problem. The moon phases and tides wouldn't align again for another month. By then, the weather could be worse. Or German intelligence could discover the real target. But then, in the early hours of June 5th, Stagg returned with a sliver of hope. A gap in the storms, 36 hours. Maybe, possibly. No guarantees. Eisenhower looked around the room at his commanders. The weight of the world pressed down on his shoulders. And then, he spoke the words that would echo through eternity. Okay, we'll go. 3 words, spoken quietly, but they unleashed the storm of war that would liberate a continent. June 5th, 11 p.m. While most of the world slept, the sky over Normandy began to fill with the thunder of engines. More than 13,000 American and British paratroopers crammed into C-47 transport planes, weighed down by 90 pounds of gear, parachutes, weapons, ammunition. Many of them were barely 20 years old. Some had never fired a shot in combat, and they were about to jump into the night over enemy territory. The plan was precise. Drop behind the beaches, secure bridges, cut communication lines, create chaos in the German rear. But war never follows the plan. Anti-aircraft fire tore through the formations. Pilots took evasive action. Cloud cover obscured the drop zones. And when those men jumped into the darkness, they were scattered across 40 square miles of occupied France. Many drowned in flooded fields, dragged under by their own gear. Others landed in trees, hanging helpless as German patrols fired up at them. Some came down miles from their objectives, alone in enemy territory with only a cricket clicker to identify fellow soldiers in the dark. Click-clack, click-clack, the sound of hope in the blackness. But here's what the history books often miss. Those scattered, isolated paratroopers improvised. Small groups of strangers banded together. They attacked German positions with nothing but raw courage and desperation. By dawn, they had achieved something extraordinary. They had turned chaos into their weapon. The Germans had no idea where the attacks were coming from. Command and control collapsed. And when the beaches erupted at sunrise, the airborne forces had already won the battle behind enemy lines. June 6th, 6:30 a.m., H-hour, the moment of truth. Across 50 miles of French coastline, the largest amphibious invasion in history slammed into Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The naval bombardment had been deafening, battleships hurling tons of steel onto German fortifications. But now, as the first wave of landing craft approached the beaches, the bombardment lifted, and the German defenders woke up. Imagine being 19 years old, crammed into a Higgins boat with 30 other terrified men, salt spray freezing your face, the smell of diesel and vomit thick in your throat. The boat pitches wildly in the waves. You can hear the metallic ping of bullets hitting the steel ramp in front of you. And then, the ramp drops. For many, the first step onto French soil was their last. Machine gun fire swept the beach like a scythe. Mortar shells erupted in geysers of sand and shrapnel. Men fell by the dozens. Some drowned in 3 feet of water, too heavy with gear to stand. Others made it to the beach obstacles only to be cut down in the open. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. Only forward, into hell. This was the reality of D-Day. Not a glorious charge, not a movie, but a desperate, bloody crawl through fire and death. And yet, they kept moving. Because turning back meant certain death, and going forward meant a chance, just a chance. That's all they had. And somehow, it was enough. Of all the landing zones on D-Day, one name stands above the rest in blood and horror. Omaha Beach. The Americans who assaulted this 4-mile stretch of sand faced the most fortified German positions, the worst terrain, and the most devastating fire. Intelligence had failed. The Allied command believed they were facing a depleted German regiment. But holding Omaha was the 352nd Infantry Division, battle-hardened veterans who had been conducting exercises in the exact area just days before. The first wave was annihilated. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment landed directly in front of a heavily fortified German position. Within minutes, 96% of the company was killed or wounded. 96%. The beach was choked with bodies, burning vehicles, men screaming for medics who couldn't reach them. The surf ran red. For 2 hours, the outcome hung in balance. Officers were killed. Radios were destroyed. Chaos reigned. Back on the command ship, General Omar Bradley considered abandoning Omaha entirely and diverting forces to other beaches. The invasion, the entire war, was on the brink of catastrophic failure. But then, something happened. Something that can't be explained by tactics or firepower. Small groups of soldiers, leaderless, scared, bleeding, began to move. A sergeant here, a private there. They didn't wait for orders. They didn't have a plan. They just started climbing, up the bluffs, through the wire, into the teeth of German fire. And others followed. Not because of speeches or strategy, but because courage is contagious. By nightfall, they had done the impossible. They had taken Omaha Beach. The cost was staggering. Over 2,000 American casualties in a single day on one beach. But the toehold was secure. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been breached, and the road to Berlin was open. While American forces bled on Omaha and Utah, the British and Canadian forces were fighting their own desperate battles on Sword, Juno, and Gold beaches. These sectors had their own nightmares. At Juno Beach, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division faced a 45-minute delay in their landing. By the time they arrived, the tide had risen, covering the beach obstacles. Landing craft struck mines. Boats exploded before even reaching shore. The Canadians took the highest casualties of any division on D-Day, except for the Americans at Omaha. But they fought with a fury that shocked the German defenders. Many of these Canadians had personal reasons for being there. They remembered Dieppe, the disastrous 1942 raid where Canadian forces were slaughtered on French beaches. This time they came prepared. This time they came for revenge. And they pushed inland faster than any other Allied unit, nearly reaching the city of Caen by day's end. On Sword Beach, British commandos under Lord Lovat stormed ashore to the sound of bagpipes. Yes, bagpipes. Piper Bill Millen marched up and down the beach playing Highland Laddie, while bullets kicked up sand around his feet. The Germans held their fire for a moment, thinking he must be mad. They were right. But that madness inspired the men around him to push forward. Gold Beach saw British forces link up with American troops from Omaha, creating a continuous front. Each beach had its heroes, its tragedies, its moments of terror and triumph, and together, they formed the Iron Fist that punched through Hitler's fortress and gave Europe its first real hope in 5 years of darkness. While the world watched the beaches, another battle was being fought in the shadows. The French resistance, ordinary citizens turned saboteurs, spies, and guerrilla fighters, launched a coordinated uprising across occupied France. They had been waiting for this moment, preparing, and when the BBC broadcast the coded message, the long sobs of autumn violins, they knew. D-Day was coming. In the hours before and after the invasion, resistance fighters cut railway lines, destroyed bridges, ambushed German convoys, and severed communication cables. German reinforcements that should have reached Normandy in hours took days. Some never arrived at all. The Das Reich Panzer Division, stationed in southern France, took 17 days to travel a distance that should have taken 3. Every hour of delay saved Allied lives, but the resistance paid a terrible price. The Gestapo and SS retaliated with savage brutality. Entire villages were burned, civilians executed. At Oradour-sur-Glane, SS troops herded 642 men, women, and children into a church and barns and set them on fire. Only 6 people survived. The French resistance never wore uniforms. They received no medals on the beaches, but their sacrifice was as real as any soldiers. They were the unseen army that made D-Day possible, and their courage deserves to be remembered alongside every other hero of that day. On the German side, D-Day was a symphony of confusion, incompetence, and fatal delays. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the brilliant Desert Fox, had predicted the invasion would come at Normandy. He had begged Hitler for permission to position panzer divisions closer to the coast, but Hitler refused. The Führer was convinced the deception. He believed Normandy was a feint and the real invasion would come at Calais, and then came the ultimate stroke of dark irony. When the invasion actually began, Hitler was asleep at his mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden. His standing orders were absolute. No panzer divisions could be moved without his personal approval. But his staff were too terrified to wake him. For 6 critical hours, hours when German armor could have crushed the Allied beachheads, the panzers sat idle, waiting for a madman to wake up. By the time Hitler was informed and gave the order to move, it was too late. Allied air superiority meant daylight movement was suicide. German columns were strafed and bombed into oblivion. The reserve divisions that were supposed to throw the Allies back into the sea arrived piecemeal, exhausted, and were defeated in detail. For the German soldiers on the beaches, D-Day was a nightmare. Many were not elite SS troops, but conscripts, some as young as 16, others over 50. They fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers, firepower, and the determination of men who knew they were fighting for the survival of civilization itself. By the end of June 6, 1944, the Allies had secured a foothold in France. Over 156,000 troops had landed. 5 beachheads were established. The Atlantic Wall was broken, but the cost was almost unbearable. Over 10,000 Allied casualties, 4,000 confirmed dead, thousands more wounded, missing, or captured. Every single one of them had a name, a family, a life waiting back home that would never be the same. Walk through the American cemetery at Normandy today. 9,000 white crosses and stars of David stretching across perfectly manicured grass overlooking Omaha Beach. Each one represents a young man who never got to grow old, who never held his children, who never saw his hometown again. The average age was 22. But here's what we must understand. Their sacrifice was not in vain. Every single one of those men gave their life so that tyranny would not rule the world, so that freedom had a fighting chance, so that future generations, our generation, could live without the shadow of fascism crushing the light. General Eisenhower carried a letter in his pocket on D-Day. A letter he wrote in case the invasion failed. It took full responsibility for the disaster and exonerated everyone else. He never had to deliver it, but the fact that he wrote it shows what kind of men led that operation. They knew the stakes. They accepted the burden, and they were willing to bear the weight of history on their shoulders. If you think the story of D-Day ends on the beaches, you're missing half the battle. The landings were just the beginning. Beyond the sand lay the bocage, the nightmare terrain of Normandy. Ancient hedgerows 10 feet high, stone walls, sunken roads, and small fields that turned every farm into a fortress. The Germans called it ideal defensive ground, and they were right. For 2 months after D-Day, Allied forces ground forward meter by bloody meter through the hedgerows. Every field was a battle, every farmhouse a strong point. German snipers picked off officers. Panzerfaust teams destroyed tanks from hidden positions. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Casualties mounted into the tens of thousands, but the Allies adapted. American Sergeant Curtis Cullen invented the Rhino, steel teeth welded to the front of Sherman tanks that could tear through hedgerows. Suddenly, armor could flank German positions. Infantry could advance with cover. The stalemate broke. Operation Cobra, the breakout offensive, was launched in late July. Carpet bombing shattered German lines. American armored divisions poured through the gap. Patton's Third Army raced across France, liberating town after town. Paris fell in August. By September, the Allies were on Germany's border. The beginning of the end had begun. History remembers the soldiers who stormed the beaches. But D-Day succeeded because of thousands of unsung heroes who never fired a shot. The combat engineers who cleared beach obstacles under fire. The Navy coxswains who drove landing craft through hell to deliver their cargo of men. The medics who ran into fire to drag wounded soldiers to safety. The chaplains who held dying men's hands and whispered prayers as life faded from their eyes. And let's talk about the logistical miracle. Within days of the landings, Allied engineers had constructed the Mulberry Harbors, massive artificial ports towed across the English Channel and assembled off the Normandy coast. These floating harbors allowed supplies to pour in: ammunition, food, fuel, vehicles, reinforcements. Without them, the invasion would have withered and died. There were the cooks who worked 20-hour shifts feeding an army. The truck drivers who navigated bombed roads to deliver supplies to the front. The mechanics who kept tanks running. The clerks who processed casualty reports and wrote letters to families back home. Every one of them was essential. Every one of them was a hero, and we cannot forget the women. Nurses who worked in field hospitals mere miles from the front, performing surgery under canvas while shells fell around them. The Waves, Wacks, and Wrens who served in communications, intelligence, and logistics. The women of the OSS who parachuted into occupied France as spies. They didn't storm beaches, but without them, those beaches would never have been won. D-Day didn't just change the course of World War II, it changed the course of military history forever. Every amphibious operation since, from Incheon to the Falklands, has been built on the lessons learned on those blood-soaked beaches. Combined arms coordination, naval gunfire support, air superiority, deception operations, logistics. All of it was perfected under fire on June 6, 1944. But the real lesson of D-Day isn't military. It's human. It's the lesson that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary evil, can rise to extraordinary heights. Most of the men who landed on those beaches weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, teachers, mechanics, shop clerks, kids who had never left their hometowns. And when the moment came, they stepped off those landing craft into hell. Because they believed in something bigger than themselves. They believed in freedom, in democracy, in the idea that tyranny must be opposed no matter the cost. And that belief, that willingness to sacrifice everything for a principle, is what ultimately defeated the Third Reich. We live in their world now. The world they bought with their blood. The freedoms we take for granted exist because they refuse to let darkness win. Every generation faces its own test, its own D-Day. And the question is always the same. When the moment comes, will we have the courage they had? Will we stand or will we run? They are dying now, the men who stormed those beaches. Every day we lose more of them. The greatest generation is fading into history, taking their memories with them. But before they go, they leave us with something precious. Their voices, their truth. Listen to Private First Class Joseph Lesniewski, who landed on Omaha Beach with the big red one. I was scared to death. We all were. But you do what you have to do. You think about the guy next to you. You think about getting home, and you keep moving. Simple words. But they contain a universe of courage. Or Staff Sergeant Ray Lambert, a combat medic who saved dozens of lives on Omaha Beach before being wounded himself. People call me a hero. I'm not a hero. The heroes are the ones who didn't come home. I just did my job. They gave everything. That's the humility of the greatest generation. They saved the world, and they don't think they did anything special. Many of them never talked about D-Day. The memories were too painful, too raw. They came home, buried the horror deep inside, and tried to build normal lives. But the nightmares never fully left. The survivor's guilt. Why did I live when my buddies died? Haunted them for decades. We owe them something. We owe them remembrance. We owe them the promise that their sacrifice will never be forgotten. That the story of D-Day will be told to our children and our children's children so that the lesson endures. Freedom is never free. Someone always pays the price. There is a place in France where time stands still, where the wind carries whispers of the past, where 9,000 white markers stand in perfect rows, overlooking the beach where so many fell, the Normandy American Cemetery. It is sacred ground, consecrated not by priests, but by the blood of heroes. Stand there at sunrise, when the light first touches the crosses, and you can almost hear them. The voices of the young men who never grew old, laughing, crying, calling out to each other in the chaos. They are still there, in the sand, in the wind, in the eternal waves that crash against the shore. 81 years have passed since D-Day. The beaches are peaceful now. Tourists walk where soldiers died. Children play in the surf that once ran red with blood. And that is as it should be, because that is what they fought for. Not for glory, not for medals, but for the simple, beautiful idea that future generations should live in peace. The untold story of D-Day is not about tactics or strategy. It is about the human heart, about courage in the face of fear, about sacrifice without hesitation, about ordinary people who did the most extraordinary thing imaginable. They stood between civilization and darkness, and they held the line. So the next time you enjoy a moment of freedom, the freedom to speak your mind, to worship as you choose, to live without fear, remember them. Remember the teenagers who vomited from seasickness and then charged into machine gun fire. Remember the paratroopers who dropped into the night not knowing if they would ever see another dawn. Remember the medics, the engineers, the sailors, the pilots. Remember all of them. This has been the untold story of D-Day. If their courage moved you, if their sacrifice inspired you, then honor them by sharing this story. Hit that subscribe button. Ring the notification bell. Because at the War Files WWII, we don't just tell history. We preserve it. We protect it. We make sure that the voices of heroes never fade into silence. Next week, we uncover another forgotten chapter of World War II. Another story that deserves to be told. Stay with us, Because history is not just the past. It is the foundation of everything we are. American flag waving over cemetery at sunset, lest we forget.